Welcome, everyone. I know that some of the participants are still filing in, but as you do, I'm just going to get started. My name is Lynette Roth, and I'm the curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and the head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. And I'm going to be serving as our moderator for the Q&A later on. Before we begin today's program, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we at the university strive to honor this relationship. I want to thank you for joining this week's session of our series Art Talks Live, which offer an up-close look at works in our collections with our teams of curators, conservators, fellows, and graduate students. And as many of you know, you can join us on Zoom every other Tuesday here at 12:30 for these short interactive talks, which investigate artist materials and techniques, reveal our latest discoveries, and offer a fresh look at old favorites, all while exploring big ideas using the collections of the Harvard Art Museums. So just a few logistics. We are in the web format in Zoom, the webinar format in Zoom. So if you want to submit questions for a speaker, you can do so in the Q&A box. And the talk will last for about 15 minutes, and then we will dedicate the last 15 minutes or so to Q&A so that we can end promptly today at 1 p.m. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Jessica Williams. Jessica is a PhD candidate in the History of Art and Architecture department at Harvard University. And this past semester, we were very fortunate to have Jess as the graduate student intern in the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art. And she is going to examine with us today the work of German expressionist Käthe Kollwitz and the impact that Colwitz's work and her printmaking in particular had on the South African left. And Jess is a specialist in African modernism and is joining us today from Cape Town. I should add that Jessica's talk is part of our series related to the museum-wide initiative entitled ReFrame, to reimagine the function, role, and future of the University Art Museum. And this series of talks, which will run until mid-June, will examine difficult histories, foreground untold stories, and experiment with new approaches to the collections of the Harvard Art Museums, reflecting the concerns of our world today. And actually this semester at the museum, Jess was an integral part of thinking through many of these issues around ReFrame and contributed much to our rethinking of many of our labels in the museum's collection. So I want to thank Jess for that and also turn it over to her. So welcome, Jess.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Lynette. That was really sweet of you. I'd also like to just begin actually by thanking all of you for taking the time to tune in this afternoon for a talk that I think will be a bit different from the Art Talk Live presentations we usually do here at the Harvard Art Museums. In an attempt to build outward from our collection this afternoon, we're going to take a look at a number of prints by Käthe Kollwitz and explore how histories of exile led to their arrival not only in the Harvard Art Museum's collection, but in the homes of a number of Cape Town's young leftists. My hope is that you'll leave here today having learned a bit more about Colwitz and the work that we have by her here at Harvard, but also about her image's broader reach, about how her prints circulated among and came to inspire an entirely new generation of political activists and artists here in the global South. So let me begin then by introducing a few biographical details about the woman that we'll be spending some time with this afternoon. Käthe Kollwitz was born into a socialist and politically progressive German family in 1867. Over the course of her roughly 5-decade-long career as an artist, she produced hundreds of works and is perhaps most well known today for her self-portraits, which exhibit her evolving sense of self, and her cycles of prints, which expressed, especially later in her life, her solidarity with the working classes and growing sentiments against war. And here on the left, I'm showing you only 2 of the roughly 120 or so self-portraits that she created throughout her lifetime, a lithograph that she made when she was 37 and a woodcut that she produced roughly 20 years later when she was 56. And on the right, I've included a single print from her larger series on the Peasants' War, which we'll be returning to again shortly. Although Colwitz was drawn to revolutionary themes and subjects in her work, such as the series that I've very briefly gestured to here, she was in many ways rather conventional for her time. Throughout her life, for example, she expressed interest in both men and women, but chose to become engaged to a young doctor by the name of Karl Colwitz when she was only 17. Her decision to marry notably drew disappointment, not only from her family, who had encouraged her to pursue her artistic interests, but from her Bohemian student colleagues who were dismayed to hear that she had chosen to follow such a conventional and a bourgeois path. To Käthe's father, her marriage marked the end of her career as an artist. "You have made your choice," he had told her, "so be wholly what you have chosen to be." Although seen as a conformist by her friends and family for marrying at such a young age, Colwitz notably broke from convention in her determination to follow what she referred to as her two careers, that of a wife and of an artist. Between the birth of her two sons, she created her first major series of prints, The Weaver's Revolt, and in 1899 was invited to teach at the Berlin School for Women Artists. During her first few years at the school, she began a second, larger series of prints, which were inspired by the description, of a woman seen here in plate 5, who is said to have led a 16th century uprising known as the Great Peasants' War. Born out of her interest in this revolutionary female figure, Colwitz went on to create a series of 7 prints, which she only later arranged in the episodic sequence that you see here. One that begins with visual descriptions of the crimes committed against the peasantry, the abuse of their labor, for example, seen in this image of an overburdened man plowing a field on the left, and their rape by landlords, seen here in the image on the right of a woman lying prostrate in a field of flowers. Then moves to their armament and the swell of their uprising, seen here in sheets 3, 4, and 5, respectively, and which ends in depictions of their slaughter on the battlefield and their eventual imprisonment. While the technical skills that Colwitz employed to create these earlier series cemented her reputation as one of Germany's finest printmakers, her choice of subject matter led to her reputation as a socialist artist, a title that she later wrote, quote, clung to her from then on. Throughout the First and Second World Wars, Colwitz continued to produce works with socialist themes, images that addressed homelessness and hunger, but which also asserted the agency of workers and their ability to effect change through protest. In 1928, at the age of 61, Colwitz became the first woman to be elected to the Prussian Academy, where she served as the director of the Master Studio for Graphic Arts. By the time she was deposed from her position by Hitler's Nazi regime in 1933, both she and her work had become internationally recognized and revered. For decades, her images had circulated throughout Europe in satirical and leftist publications such as Simplicissimus, a few images or issues of which I'm showing you here, one from 1909 on the left and another from 1924, as well as a journal titled Sickle and Hammer, which later became the more well-known Der Arbeiter Illustrated Zeitung, or the Workers' Illustrated Magazine. And here in the bottom left corner, you can see a reproduction of one of Colwitz's images. In the years leading up to and during the Second World War, Colwitz's images in these publications and her actual physical prints were widely collected by both members of the working class and the petite bourgeois who shared her anti-fascist politics. As Hitler continued to consolidate his power in Germany throughout the early 1930s, Colwitz's work quite literally began to be carried abroad by those who sensed their coming persecution under the Third Reich. It was largely due to these exiles that the busch-reisinger Museum, what was then the Germanic Museum, came to be in possession of a number of Colwitz's earlier prints, such as the one that you see here. In 1932, for example, a young German immigrant by the name of Ferdinand Roten opened a small art gallery in Baltimore. Throughout the 1930s, as friends of his continued to flee an increasingly fascist Europe, they began consigning original works to him that they had managed to bring with them, a large number of which were apparently by Colwitz. In 1933, Roten worked with the Worcester Museum of Art to help organize the first exhibition of Colwitz's work in America, a small selection of which were shown in Cambridge the following year. And here I'm showing you just 2 images from our own archives at Harvard. On the left-hand side is a letter that Ferdinand Roten actually wrote to Charles Kuhn, who was the then director of the museum. And I love it because it just kind of shows, the curatorial things that we deal with at museums, the prices of shipping, when certain prints would be available, all of that sort of stuff. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a page from the original Worcester catalog, and you can see where Charles Kuhn was selecting which prints it was he wanted to be able to show at Harvard. And the first, I think 6 or 7 of them are actually prints from the Peasants' War, the Peasants' Revolt. Pages from the Germanics Museum's annual report from 1933 and 1934 show that Kuhn had not only considered the exhibition to be a success, but that he had decided to move forward in purchasing, quote, a small group of Colwitz's prints for the museum's permanent collection. A full-face self-portrait from 1923, an image of a widow from Colwitz's series on war, and this print of a woman sharpening her scythe. At the same time that emigres like Ferdinand Roten were working to expand Colwitz's audience in America, her work was also beginning to be introduced into contexts like mine. As nations throughout the world continued to close their borders to German Jewish refugees, those fleeing Nazism began to be flung further afield. Anne Fisher, the photographer that I'm writing my dissertation on, for example, had initially fled Berlin in 1933 for Tel Aviv. From Palestine, she traveled to Greece, backpacked through Yugoslavia and France, and eventually arrived in Britain, where she was ultimately denied asylum. With the help of a Jewish refugee group in London, Fisher secured passage on a ship bound for South Africa and arrived in 1937, effectively destitute, save for her camera and a few personal belongings. Politicized by the rise of fascism in Europe, Fisher joined Cape Town socialists shortly after she arrived in the city and went on to work alongside them, albeit unsuccessfully, to try to stop the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and the coming to power of the apartheid regime. Like many of those in her social circle, Fisher owned a number of books on Colwitz, as well as a small portfolio of her prints. Now, I'm sure that you can surmise from the title of my talk that Fisher wasn't the only German Jewish emigre who had brought Colwitz with her to Cape Town. In the early 1930s, Siegbert Eich, a Jewish art collector, and his partner, Rudolf von Freeling, also fled Nazi Germany for South Africa. According to those who knew them, the couple who had been able to bring a few portfolios of their art collection with them when they left Europe, namely more portable graphic works, such as earlier prints by Albert Dürer and contemporary work by Käthe Kollwitz. Unfortunately, little is remembered about Siegbert Eich, who appears here dressed in black, and his partner, Rudolf von Freeling, who stands immediately behind him in gray. Like Fisher, Siggy and Rudy, as I've been told they were called, arrived in Cape Town just as South Africa was beginning to close its borders to Jewish refugees. Shortly after they landed in the city, they entered into its leftist bohemian groups and began contributing to various political causes. In the early 1940s, for example, they were said to have held art exhibitions in their small apartment where they charged an entrance fee in order to raise money for the Soviet war effort. Over the course of their first few years in South Africa, the couple became acquainted with the country's modern artists and began to more formally reestablish themselves as art dealers. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, they sold, gifted, and exchanged works that they had brought with them from Europe and contributed in ways that I'm actually still learning to the country's burgeoning modernisms. And here I'm showing you one of 2 portraits that Irma Stern, one of South Africa's most well-known modernists, painted of Eich and apparently gave to him in exchange for one of his prints by Albert Dürer. So while Stern may have been interested in collecting prints from the German Renaissance during this period, South Africa's more left-leaning artists were perhaps understandably beginning to seek out works by Käthe Kollwitz. In the years leading up to and during the Second World War, institutions in South Africa had become, just as they had in Germany, fiercely contested sites. When the head of the South African National Gallery, Professor Edward Roarth, publicly commended Hitler for, quote, stemming the flood of degenerate art by giving the exponents of modernism their choice between the lunatic asylum and the concentration camp, end quote, many of Cape Town's modernists rebelled. They held exhibitions, wrote editorials and columns, and began to wage a battle against what they rightfully considered to be the steady rise of fascist white supremacist policies. And here I'm showing you a page from the South African National Gallery's scrapbooks to give you a sense of how European modernists were being discussed in this country's more mainstream press during the period, as obscene half-wits, for example, who not only sabotaged beauty, but threatened the so-called purity of the nation and its culture. In the more left-leaning South African press, Modern artists such as Lippy Lipschitz warned against Roth's desire to, quote, cleanse the nation of its degenerate influences, and made a case for studying the work of, quote, Lieberman, Corinth, Kokoschka, and most importantly, Käthe Kollwitz. Barred from the South African National Gallery, Colwitz's work was instead exhibited in individual homes where it was looked to by young artists who had been denied access to the country's art schools due to the state's increasingly racist educational policies. Among those who encouraged young artists of color to continue honing their craft despite being prohibited from pursuing fine arts degrees were none other than Ziggy and Rudy. In the years leading up to and during apartheid, the couple shared their expansive personal collection of prints and drawings with students who otherwise wouldn't have had access to them. In the early 1950s, for example, they befriended a young artist of color named Albert Adams and began a relationship with him that would last for the remainder of their lives. Adams was born in Johannesburg in 1929 and moved to Cape Town when he was only 4. As a teenager, he began taking art classes at St. Philip's School in District 6, where he writes, he began to become politicized. To make money, he worked for a brief period as a window dresser, which is how he met Rudolf von Freeling and the man he lovingly depicts here in a range of teals, blues, pinks, and purples, Siegfried Ike. As Adams noted, he had been incredibly taken by Ziggy and Rudy's collection of graphic works, particularly the drawings and prints that they had managed to retain by Colwitz, such as her 1925 lithograph, Prisoners Listening to Music. In Adams's earlier work from this period, we can begin to see his developing expressionist style and his intentional quotation of Colwitz, whose work he admired for not only its technical quality, but its political tendency. Rather than depicting an image of a single woman sharpening her scythe, Adams here presents a dense cluster of workers armed with pitchforks. After being rejected from the University of Cape Town's Michaelis School of Fine Art in the early 1950s, Ziggy and Rudy encouraged Adams to apply for a scholarship that would enable him to leave apartheid South Africa and to study at the Slade School of Fine Art in London. From there, he would go on to study with Oskar Kokoschka and further develop his style, producing work that was incredibly emotional, technically innovative, and politically poignant. Käthe Kollwitz passed away in 1945, and although she traveled to Russia and knew of her work's reception there, it is doubtful that she would have had any sense of how her images were being received in South Africa in the decade leading up to National Party rule. In the years immediately following her death and the end of the Second World War, her work found new life among South Africa's modern artists and political activists who turned to her oeuvre not only as a template for radical change, but for motivation to keep fighting. In fact, so many artists and political activists looked to her work during this period that I've chosen to mention only a few in these last couple of minutes, whose names I think you might recognize. Well, I've chosen in this really short talk to focus more specifically on Cape Town in the 1940s. Graphic artists living in Johannesburg, such as Ezram Lahai, Dumile Finney, and even William Kentridge, whose work we now have a number of examples of in our collection here at Harvard, also looked to Colwitz during their formative years. Political activists who had endured years of imprisonment, such as Dennis Goldberg, whom you see here, acknowledged the importance of her work during their captivity, and leftists who would eventually be forced into exile, such as Ray Alexander and Jack Simons, owned and displayed her work in their home. Ray and Jack had actually owned a 1922 self-portrait by Colwitz, and even though I can't see her, their daughter Mary, I think, is in the audience with us today. One last example I wanted to mention were Molly and Bram Fisher, the latter of whom you might recognize for having actually represented Nelson Mandela and his comrades in the 1963 Rivonia trial. Molly and Bram actually owned one of Colwitz's Prisoners Listening to Music prints, one of the same images that had inspired Albert Adams all of those years ago. As one of the Art Talk Live sessions dedicated to the museum's new ReFrame initiative, I wanted to end my talk by saying how important I think it is that we return to artists whose oeuvres we think we know, and to trace their lineages and contexts outside of their own. The history of South Africa's exiles, those who fled here during the Second World War to escape Nazi persecution, and those like Albert Adams, who later left to escape a similarly racist regime, serve to remind us that neither the events that caused these dislocations nor the struggles against them were isolated. Their stories and their work can teach us about international networks of solidarity during times of crisis and renew our belief in the power of visual art and representation to contribute toward a more just and equitable society. After today, My hope is that you'll see Colwitz's work in a slightly larger context than maybe you did before, and perhaps even draw new inspiration from it, regardless of wherever it is in the world you happen to be. And with that, I'd love to turn this back over to you, Lynette, and to any questions that you or anyone else might have.
Great, thank you so much, Jess. You've managed to pack a lot into our very brief format for today, and I think really showed and really opened up not just the work of Colwitz, but also, the way that we think, and you and I have talked about this in another forum on Instagram, but also how we think about the Busch-Reisinger Museum and what especially German Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, but really German exiles and emigres around the world, how we can begin to rethink also how our collections can be thought of and expanded outwards from that. I really loved actually the comparison, if you wouldn't mind going back to it, of the Albert Adams and the Colwitz. And I wanted to press a little bit. You have mentioned to me in another context the issue of translation as being something that you've thought about. People often ask, how do we think about questions of influence? And you did mention that this was in some ways really a direct quotation of Colwitz. And I was hoping you could just say a little bit more also about Adams's work and how you see that connection to Colwitz and that inspiration.
Sure. So Albert Adams was, as I mentioned, was introduced to Colwitz through Siggy and Rudy. And he mentions, there's been a couple of exhibition catalogs published on him with Marilyn Martin, who's this phenomenal South African art historian. If anyone is curious to learn more about him, I would highly recommend looking into her work on him. But he spoke a lot about this print in particular as being a big influence on his work and the other prints that were in the collection of Siggy Rudy more generally. I think that from this, he moved forward. He would go on to study with Oskar Kokoschka and just be inspired, I think, by the expressionists more generally, the German expressionists. But he was always drawn to, drawing. He did make some prints throughout his life. Colwitz is famous for her prints. That's how I first came to her work. And he did create some prints, but mostly larger scale paintings and drawings were the things that he later did in life. And I think I showed later on, these, like the Abu Ghraib figure from 2004, it's actually quite a massive painting. So while he might have been influenced by Colwitz in terms of, some of the aesthetics, the expressionist line drawing, even maybe some of the way that her political tendency was kind of operating in her work, he really took aspects from it that I think he found were useful and then moved onward from there, which I think is what happens with a lot of these sorts of things. It's not, like I had mentioned before, I never really see these as being kind of a mapping of one thing onto another, but more of a really selective choice of certain aspects that then artists use to come up with their own style and to say the things that they want to say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really evident, and I think it's fascinating that he then studied with Kokoschka. So it's almost
crazy. I'll have to, after this, or if anyone else is interested, Kokoschka actually recorded for Albert Adams when he came back to South Africa, he had a big exhibition here, and Kokoschka recorded an opening for him where he gives talks about Albert Adams, and they played it in, I think, Johannesburg at the opening of his show, which is really just an incredible little side story. But yeah, he had an amazing life, Albert Adams did. And his partner, Ted Glennon, still lives in London. Also an incredible man.
So talking about artists in South Africa, there was a question in the Q&A whether there are any women or women identifying artists in South Africa, particularly Black, that draw or drew inspiration from Colwitz. You did mention a number of artists at the end.
Yeah, I honestly would tell you that I probably am not the best person to ask that. I don't know the answer to that question, if I'm being honest. I do know of some women modernists who are working, like Irma Stern, obviously, but she was, German and Jewish. There was Maggie Love. There are a lot of women immigrant artists who were familiar with Colwitz's work that I know of. Maggie Lobster is one. and a number of others. But if anyone knows of any particularly Black women who were working during this period in the 30s and 40s in particular, or maybe knew of Colwitz's work and were drawing on it, I would be extremely keen to hear about it. But unfortunately, I can't give you any names.
Yeah, because it was, I mean, in some ways, you really did start from her position as a woman and an artist, and one who, actually had a unique experience, and that her family was encouraging her to make different choices for her life and her career than she ultimately made, but managed obviously to have incredible success. Regardless of the fact that she was a mother and a wife as well. So we had some specific questions about Colwitz, for example, whether she was associated with the South African Communist Party or the Congress of South African Trade Unions.
That's a great question. I don't think she would have been, if Käthe Kollwitz would have been. She died in 1945. Which obviously the Communist Party of South Africa was around then, but I don't think Colwitz herself would have been aware of kind of anything that was happening here. That isn't to say though that they didn't use her work, right? So they obviously knew of her work. Ray Alexander and Jack Simons were communists, and they collected her work, and her work was used, like I said, for to raise money for things like the Soviet war effort. So that might have been a little bit more one-sided. I mean, like I said, there might be some magical thing in an archive somewhere that I'm unaware of, which would be incredible. But I don't think that Colwitz knew herself kind of about how her work was being received or used in this particular context. I mentioned she did go to Russia, and I think she might have, had a sense of how her work was being received globally. But I couldn't say if she would have known what was happening more here in the global South.
And that actually links to another question that we had, and that has to do also with her commitment to the print medium and the role of the print, as you also pointed out, right? You mentioned that these prints were literally being carried, right, with refugees and emigres from Nazi Germany, that the print itself, right, allows for a kind of distribution. And the question was whether you could actually speak a little bit more to that, to the size of Colwitz's editions. Was she thinking about that when she was making her prints?
Sure. Oh, actually, it might be this way. Sorry, I don't want to make everyone dizzy. Yeah, I mean, so Colwitz, when she was making a number of her series of prints, one in particular was the series on war, which I think we might own all of those wood blocks. They were a woodcut print series. But she specifically says, I want the entire world, I want these to go throughout the entire world. And her choice of print was specific. I mean, it traveled well. She was able to make cheaper, larger portfolios. So here I'm showing you, and actually it's in the other office, but I have this mappa by her, and it's quite small. It would fit within in a luggage, or like in suitcases, for example. So it was really portable, and I think that was one of her main missions, was to make her work available to the working class and to people who wanted to be able to use her work. And I mean, this was also picked up again by later generations of South African artists. I mean, for this talk, focused really specifically on the pre-apartheid period, so the years leading up to the Afrikaner nationalists taking power. But obviously in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and 90s, I mean, there were some incredible print studios, a lot of them in exile, who made prints specifically because they knew that it was it could be used to make political moves, right? It could be posted places and circulated a lot easier than a lot of other medium could be. And actually, while I'm on this, I'm sure that there's another question, but if you're interested in these topics of global exchange and about Colwitz's work circulating, there's going to be this incredible exhibition opening up at the Reina Sofia in Spain. I know Benjamin Buchloh is, I think, if not one of the main curators, has been working on it. And it's on Colwitz's work and its reception in Mexico. So, I'm not the only person who's kind of interested in her international reception abroad during these years and in the later decades. I mean, there is a kind of a growing interest in that. And if you're keen, if you're more interested in the global South in that direction, then I would highly recommend checking out that exhibition.
That actually links to a question we had as well about whether the South African leftist artists that you were talking about were aware of the Mexican and Chinese print workshops in the 1940s.
That's a good question.
Well.
I know that they were aware of the Mexican workshops. I couldn't tell you as much about the Chinese side. I myself am not too familiar with that history in particular. But there are a lot of incredible women, one of them, a woman named Dora Taylor, who was a Trotskyist and a literary critic. And she completely admired Diego Rivera's work. I mean, she used to write about him and his, like the work that he was producing and had the political impetus and how all of the artists in South Africa needed to look to his work and be able to like mobilize in that way. She was a huge promoter of him. I mean, what she could get a hold of. That's another thing. I mean, I would say that South Africa was quite isolated in a lot of ways in the 30s and 40s, and even afterwards during apartheid, when certain materials were banned from being allowed into the country, for example. But Dora Taylor and a lot of these leftists got a lot of this material, prints, publications that they weren't supposed to have, communist materials from a female bookseller up in Johannesburg named Fanny Klinnerman, who would import all of this kind of illicit leftist stuff and then kind of circulate it from Joburg throughout the rest of the country. So I think that's how Dora Taylor got her hands on some of Diego Rivera's work and some of the Mexican printmakers. So that's one example I can think of on that side. I'm sure that there are others though.
Well, this is fascinating. I'm going to just take one more question. There are a number of questions and also really interesting comments in the chat. So I will make sure that Jessica gets a copy of all of this. There was just thinking of sort of contemporary artists as well. And you mentioned William Kentridge. There was a question in the chat of whether Kim Berman, a contemporary printmaker who started artist-proof studios near Johannesburg, might have been influenced by Colwitz.
I mean, it's possible. I can't imagine why not. I mean, I think that I'm sure that she knew of her work, I guess is what I would say. I mean, artists will decide whether or not they like it or what they want to take from it. But I think that, the art schools here in South Africa, especially kind of the underground ones, they were well aware of everything that was happening in Europe and things that were happening, like I was mentioning with Diego Rivera and Latin America. So I'm sure that she probably would have known of her work, but I can't say whether or not she specifically was influenced by it. But that's another thing. If I can't see the chat right now, but when I get in there, I'll look at who wrote that and maybe can get in touch with them, because that would be a wonder. I would love to talk to that person and to kind of see what they're thinking.
Yeah, we will definitely forward all of that information onto you, Jess. And I would say, just a lot of interest in Colwitz also generally. So that's great. And again, we have wonderful examples of her work at the museum. And Jess, during her tenure at the museums, worked on an installation of a couple of Colwitz's prints, which we hope to have up in the spring. So another reason to visit the museums in person as soon as we can do that again. We are planning for September 1st. So fingers crossed that that is something we can announce officially. I want to thank Jess so much for this incredibly rich talk. And if you're interested in Jess's dissertation research, and thinking more about issues of global migration, you can also check out our Instagram site called Bush Hall, which is about the Busch-Reisinger Museum and questions around identity. And Jess joined us there a couple of weeks ago on Instagram Live to talk about her work and also the broader issue of global migration. So if you're looking for more from Jess, you can find it there. I want to say that I hope you will all join us in 2 weeks' time on Tuesday, June 15th for our next Art Talk Live. It's going to be with Julie Wurtz. Julie is the Beale Family Postgraduate Fellow in Conservation Science in the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies. And she's going to speak to us about how the technical study of Egyptian textiles can help us learn more about their unknown makers. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And of course, you can always check out our online calendar for that and other upcoming programs. So I just want to thank Jess again for joining us today from Cape Town. And thank you all again for tuning into Art Talks Live.